Okay, thank you very much. As said, I'm Rick Crosby. I'm one of the pre-sales technical consultants based out of the UK. And prior to my joining UiPath, I have been in the test automation space, going all the way back actually into the 90s to show my age. So I've really been working quite closely with the product management team and how we are going to be positioning ourselves in the testing space. And I'll be going through really the major value drivers, which is driving this particular marketplace and how we're really disrupting this space. And one of the key themes is the turning of a testing department into a value generation department. So I've got a short presentation. I'll go through some slides so that you guys can understand the concepts, and then I can go into a deeper demo and show you exactly how all of these different departments can work as one in really making a truly enterprise-wide automation solution. So if I just go in and say that one of the major buzzwords which is in the industry at the moment is digital transformation, and there's certain different websites out there, analyst reports, but they're estimating that by the end of next year, it's going to be a $2.2 trillion market. So this is all in services and software, etc. But this is a huge amount of work which almost every single organization is trying to get to grips with. And a huge part of digital transformation is automation, because automation really can accelerate and enable the digital transformation a lot of these organizations are really looking for. And some interesting stats out there from an automation perspective. McKinsey recently did an analyst report, and they estimate that 45% of all work activities which is done today has the potential to be automated by existing technology. So we're not talking about some future technology or vaporware. The technology we have today, we can be automating a significant chunk of people's day-to-day work and activity. And 83% of IT decision makers really believe that automation is completely essential as a building block towards this digital transformation they all actually pursue. And that is really what's driven our traditional market, our RPA market, on such a rocket ship kind of trajectory, is that the automation is becoming absolutely key in any kind of strategy within these particular organizations. But if I just go through now and say the actual results don't really pan out that this transformation is going smoothly, and the reason for this is that the automation traditionally has been done differently in the different departments within a particular organization, and that's really ended up with these organizations having siloed automation teams. But this is really a problem that a lot of organizations are trying to overcome, and a lot of them are just realizing, okay, we need to basically be spending more and really getting different projects going forward to try and automate as much as possible. And we've seen a huge increase in IT budget spend, up to like 30% of IT budget is in automation related technologies. But even with all of this input, EY did a recent report and said approximately 50% of automation projects they see get kicked off won't deliver the results which were intended, or will actually get restarted, or will go down and mark down as a failure. And this has really resulted in a result there. We reckon about less than 5% of large enterprises have truly scaled to have a very large scale automation solution without their organization. And we've got many use cases where people have done large scale automation with UiPath, and this is really what we're really trying to get now into other organizations, because we believe we do offer this platform solution to enable these very large scale automations. It's worth really noting at this point as well, when I'm talking about automation, I'm actually talking about the traditional automation in the testing department, which maybe some guys on the call who are just from a test automation background or a testing background. So I'm really talking about automation in general, which includes test automation, but also the traditional RPA automation. In many senses, you could see testing is really just an internal business process, which is very mundane, very repetitive, and is an ideal candidate for automation. And that is why test automation has been around for over 20 years. So from an automation perspective, we can just see that we're really expanding our capabilities to really leverage that use case of having automation in the testing department. But the other side to this as well is that testing traditionally is testing the applications which an enterprise uses. What we can really see now is these organizations should be seeing their RPA robots as really another form of their application landscape. And this is where you could say automation has now become the application as well, especially in some mission critical RPA robots which are running in production environments. So that's why you can see this consolidation of these teams is really almost obvious, but they are so closely related, and we're really now trying to drive this consolidation of these different siloed departments together to really come up with a really long-term valuable solution. But one of the reasons that automation hasn't scaled, and this has been known in the testing world with test automation as well, is that the landscape's getting more and more complicated. It's not uncommon to have a large enterprise client who has between 1,000 and 5,000 applications being used within that organization. And this can result in up to 100 updates per day. So if you imagine you've got all these different back-end systems, you've got bespoke applications, you've got department-centric applications, you've got third-party applications, you've got packaged applications. These landscapes are just becoming more and more complicated. And therefore, the testing also in parallel becomes more and more of a challenge to make sure that everything works correctly and seamlessly in production. And there's many cases of horror stories where things go wrong and banking systems go down and get sued, etc. So therefore, following suit to try and avoid all of these nightmares, the testing spend's been increasing as well. And here you can see we've gone from 18% in 2012 up to 20% or 30% now in 2020. So this is really an area which is going to be extremely important for automation to really break into. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons the automation scaling is such a challenge, and I include test automation in that as well, is that we have various different on-prem solutions, cloud-based solutions, but also what's important is the actual environment that they're actually running in is constantly changing as well. So for example, something as simple as a Windows update might actually break particular automations or might actually go through and change how a particular application responds, and therefore the automation might actually break. But we've also got various different on-prem applications like SAP, these packaged applications, and third-party and a lot more cloud-based applications now, things like Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, etc. These are all completely out of the control of the enterprise to manage their updates, etc. So we need some kind of solution which can keep in sync and make sure that everything carries on and remains running smoothly. So if I just go through and show you what can happen and what we can see in various organizations try and scale their automation. What happens is they start their journey and we start to get significant ROI from automating various different processes. And we can see this will increase very rapidly as they go through and get really easy to use use cases, automate them, and then the business get really excited and this RPA is absolutely amazing, or this test automation is amazing. What will happen is this particular return investment and the speed of it will start to slow down, and eventually we'll come to an inflection point where the scaling actually comes to a complete halt. And the reason for that is that the maintenance of the current automations become the biggest part of their the working day, and just basically trying to keep that particular automations up and running, managing the updates, managing the defects which are occurring in production and mending those becomes all encompassing. But with UiPath, and I'll show you with the new 21.4 release and also the 21.10 release, we released modern automation, and that really overcomes a lot of these problems with keeping automations up and running. And I'll show you some use cases how we can automatically overcome a lot of these changes. But a lot of the solution to this maintenance trap and this getting bogged down with just trying to maintain your current automation on a day-to-day basis isn't just about the technology. It's more about how the organization really go about structuring their automation process. And this is where we see the fully automated enterprise really coming into itself. And it's when we use one automation tool across all of the different departments, they can then start to really share, reuse, and keep the updates from each other, which will significantly increase this maintenance bottleneck that every organization comes to. And this is really what this presentation is about, is how we can create this value, this extra value, by using a platform like UiPath. So traditionally, we have the RPA processes, and these are now running in a particular business environment. And as we've mentioned, there's many things which can change in that environment to cause those automations to fail. And this will lead to almost like a continuous maintenance problem. Every day they'll have something else which needs updating in their environment. If you imagine having 100 or even thousands of automations in production, this can become all-encompassing. But within the department or within the enterprise, we still have departments like the IT operations, which manage over test environments and pre-production environments. And obviously, we still have development teams which are doing a lot of the internal development for those particular applications. And they're going to be aware of these application and automation and environment issues a lot earlier on. So this is what we really want to try and do, is pull all of this together. So traditionally, in the enterprises we see, these are still governed by different departments, which will come up with different solutions. So traditionally, the development team will either come up with their own scripting technology, or we might be using bespoke legacy test automation solutions like Selenium, open source, etc., or even still doing a lot of the testing manually. IT operations will use a lot of automation as well. They'll be deploying applications, updating environments, test environments, pre-production environments, deploying to production, the release management, etc. All that can be automated as well. But again, they might be using completely separate, set of automation tools. And this really means a lot of these teams are actually doing a lot of similar tasks, but it's completely redundant, and we cannot reuse any of that between those particular organizations. And this is what's leading to siloed tooling, artifacts, and obviously also the siloed skill set as well. So what we really see from a UiPath perspective is we've been extremely strong, and our growth has obviously been driven by the onboarding of automation in the RPA space. And we really want to make those RPA processes more resilient. So this is where we said, okay, we need to be testing our RPA, because as I mentioned earlier, you could see the automation has become the new applications, and these need testing just as any other application which is deployed to production. So therefore, we'll see in a moment how Test Suite can test our RPA processes, and that's how we can really increase the resilience of our automations. But the real interest is that we still have a department out there, the application testing, which is normally traditionally associated a lot closer to the development teams, but they will be going through and testing the underlying applications just from an application testing perspective. Now, we might have some automation in there already, but we also see a lot of these organizations will still do a lot of this manually. So if we could get them to start to use UiPath, and as you guys who have already used Studio will know, it's extremely quick and simple to create automations. So even if they're using manual testing, they can get up to speed with UiPath extremely quickly, or they could migrate some of their testing from some of the legacy tools to a significantly more powerful automation solution, and really automate their test automation. And one of the key words you'll hear in the testing world is continuous testing, where you're continuously testing the new releases of their particular applications. But we're seeing that we're going to be going one stage further. And we're not just doing continuous testing, but we're going to basically be able to be testing the RPA solutions and the test automation solutions. So we're testing the automation itself. And this is going to really lead us on to creating automations which are continuously being updated, managed, and tested at the same time. And this is really what good will look like in the future when an enterprise fully automates being across their entire different departments within their organization. And this will result in a significantly lower maintenance in their production environments, because the RPA solutions will be aware of the environment, automation, and application issues, simply because these teams will also be using UiPath. And what we'll see in the demonstration is these teams will be designing their automations in such a way that we're going to have a lot of the functionality can be reusable, and we can create libraries of automations, which was going to be owned and and created initially by the testing department when they're testing their particular applications. That can then be shared with the IT operations department, and importantly, the RPA guys can reuse exactly those same libraries. And this is really where this value is going to come from. And as the development team, because they're exposed to, by definition, all the new development which is done within the organization, all the new updates, all the changes to their applications, if they need to modify their automation to test that, they can update their library to allow that modification to work and their automations to work. And therefore, the RPA guys will be getting a lot of the rework already done for them. So they'll just get a message, we've got a new build of software, this is the new build coming through, this is the new library of UiPath automations which will work with this particular version. And therefore, the amount of maintenance done in the production environment and in the center of excellence from an RPA perspective is going to be massively reduced. So this is where we say, having enterprise-wide automation really does win championships. And this is where we're going to be sharing one tool set, sharing all of those artifacts. But the other key area here is the sharing of skill sets as well. So if you can imagine now, the RPA center of excellence is really going to morph with the testing center of excellence into a enterprise automation center of excellence. So everyone's got a very, very similar skill set. So the testers will be concentrating still on their testing activities, but their automation skills are going to be completely reusable in the RPA space as well. So we'll see, engineers who are working in the testing department doing complicated testing becoming extremely valuable because they can actually add business value from the RPA side of things as well. So this, collaboration of these testing teams is going to be really valuable, not only for the enterprise who does it, but also for the individual employees in these departments, because they can reuse their skills, across a wider audience within the particular enterprise. So this is really where we see the fully, automated enterprise, which you will hear, and we've actually trademarked that particular, marketing phrase as well. Is the business, the development, and the operations team all coming under one umbrella of one unified automation platform, which is, the UiPath solution. So what we're seeing from our various different partners, we're obviously working very closely with different organizations and our partner organizations. And one of our partners came back to us and they did a study on some of their clients they were working with of just how much this actually means and how much return investment they can get back from this. Just in the testing departments, they realized that by automating a lot of their manual test cases and or migrating a lot of their legacy automations away from a legacy tool into UiPath, they could significantly increase the amount of test case creation, which basically means they can create more testing over more release cycles of their application, so they can increase their test coverage significantly, and or reduce the costing of testing, because one of the bottlenecks in the development is the testing phase. So that's a huge benefit by using UiPath in that space. And what makes UiPath so successful in the RPA world, most of our core automation is completely relevant to automation within the testing world as well. And I'll show you some of the, the extra things we've now got specifically to testing to make our lead in that space even further. But it's the reuse of those assets which is going to be the real game changer, because at the moment, if a testing team is using a completely different testing tool, all they're really doing is creating automation specifically for testing. It's got no value outside of that. By using UiPath, the vast majority of their efforts and their work can actually be reused. So it's going to be a significant amount of reuse in the RPA space to, again, reduce the amount of cost it takes them and the speed at which they can get any automations up and running. And the key area here is the maintenance is going to be significantly reduced. As I mentioned earlier on, if a test development team are exposed to a new version of software that they need to test, they update their automations for that, they can then reshare all of that library information. And this is the key point, where the maintenance is going to be massively reduced. And we can push an enterprise, to making the most of any automation solution and overcoming this maintenance gap. So I'm sure a lot of you have either used UiPath already or seen other webinars and meetups, etc. And the test suite is just really a portion of the fully automated enterprise solution, which comes from UiPath, right from the discover to the engage. So I'm going to be concentrating on really the particular testing piece, but it's really important to understand that we have this vision of having one tool across every single department, and one robot for every desktop within a particular organization is where we're getting to. So everything I'm really we'll be covering today is relevant throughout the entire enterprise. But just to give you a quick overview of the architecture, so when we see the actual product, you can understand how it's all bolted together. A lot of you will be aware of our core products. So this is Studio, Orchestrator, and the robot. And what we've done from a test suite perspective is we've extended the capability of each of these. So we've got now Studio Pro, which adds on specific testing functionality, which I'll show you in the demonstration. But also we've got integration into third-party tools, things like Appium for mobile testing and device farms like Source Labs. Also things like API testing through Postman. So these are just some extra capabilities, but the core functionality is exactly the same as what we enjoy in the RPA space, and what's made us successful in the RPA space will also make us successful in the testing space as well. We've extended the capabilities of Orchestrator specifically for testing activities, and you'll see in the demonstration how we use Orchestrator to kick off execution of test cases, and how the reporting of those test case executions is done, and how that's then automatically synchronized back to our test manager, which we'll see as well. The other thing to be aware of, we also have test robots. Now, a test robot functionally or technically is almost the same as a standard unattended robot, but it's been designed just to be able to execute test cases. And the reason we did that is we wanted these test robots to be significantly cheaper than our standard RPA unattended robots. So therefore you can utilize many robots in your testing department to really ramp up the amount of testing you do. So you could just see a test robot as a significantly cheaper version of a standard robot you might already be using. And then one of the new products we've developed from scratch is our test manager. Now, traditionally, UiPath, we've been very, very open to our architecture, and we've always basically leveraged best of breed tools which are already out there. We don't want to go out there and reinvent the wheel. So when we started designing our test manager, we realized many organizations, indeed most large enterprises especially, already had application lifecycle management tooling, which they used as part of their development. So things like Jira, if they're an SAP shop, they'd have SAP Solution Manager. But Microsoft Azure DevOps is getting a lot of power as well there. So really early on, we realized we needed integrations into these particular tool sets. So that's basically how we've designed our test manager. It's all based on our test manager hub, where we do have a standalone test manager, which you can utilize, but a lot of the larger organizations will also be linking into these standard tool sets to really have a seamless integration into how they do their development, how they do their testing today. But what we did find when we created the test manager, it's a very simple way to manage requirements and test cases associated with those requirements. We can also have a very comprehensive analytics reporting. But one of the interesting areas was we wanted to have the reporting of manual test cases alongside any automation you do. Because it's very rare that you can fully automate a testing department. There's always going to be some kind of exploratory testing or certain manual test cases which need to be there. And that's where we've utilized one of our newer products, which is Task Capture, which is originally designed to be a process documentation tool to create process definition documentation. But we can use exactly the same application to go through and document your manual test cases. And indeed, a lot of our customers have realized this is a super simple way to even migrate a lot of their Excel spreadsheets, which might have lots of different test steps in there, which the manual testers go through. If we can use our task capture to very quickly and easy document and explain in a lot more detail with all the different screenshots of those manual test cases. It's been extremely powerful. So that's just basically seamlessly integrated into our test manager as well. So what you can see is what we've done at UiPath when we started down the retesting road. Is we realized we needed to both test our RPA and almost treat RPA as an application, but also we wanted to get into the traditional testing market and be able to use the tool to do traditional test automation of the underlying applications. So you can see that what we really say is the application testing and RPA testing is really one of the same. And this is what you should really see UiPath Test Suite as. It's a consolidation. It's not just us going into the testing market and expanding our market into that area. We're really finding that the consolidation of these particular departments is really where the value is. It's a 2 + 2 = 5 kind of equation. And hopefully when I show you the demonstration, you will agree that that's where the large organizations will get their biggest value, is having everything under one umbrella. So I'll just quickly go through the why you should care, because a lot of you might already be using traditional testing tools, but one of the reasons we've been so successful in the RPA world is the underlying automation tool is extremely powerful. But what really leveraged us to make this consolidation relatively straightforward is we've always had libraries, and now we've extended our capabilities to have things like object repositories, where we can actually have all the selectors for our UIs in one centrally governed place. And this really allows the reuse of automations to be relatively straightforward. And this is what I'll show you in the demonstration later on. And things like assets being stored centrally in our orchestrator also means it's extremely powerful and easy to use. We very easily can integrate into all the different technologies. I'm sure you're aware of the automation from UiPath, and we can have computer vision to do really challenging automations via Citrix, for example, or remote desktop. We've also added quite comprehensive capability for testing mobile, because in the mobile world, testing of mobile applications is extremely important. So we've created a whole new capability around our mobile testing. And as you mentioned with the API, this is an area which is of growth as well. And it's very easy to integrate any API testing with UiPath. And again, we can also integrate third-party tools, things like Postman. One of the challenges in the testing department world, and especially before I came to UiPath, is how do you orchestrate and how do you actually manage the execution of all of your individual test cases? And we already have a production grade orchestration tool from the RPA world, which has been designed to run in production systems. So with security, it's already Vericode certified, role management, etc. We can just reuse all of that. And this means the tool in the testing department is going to be extremely secure, extremely easy to govern and report upon. And things like credential management, etc. Again, we've been used credential management in production systems for many times in many high security conscious businesses like banking and insurance, etc. All of this is now become to be usable within the test department as well. And again, we can go through, and I'll show you at the end of my demonstration what good looks like from a governance of your actual automation process itself, and things like integration into like continuous integration, continuous delivery tools like Jenkins or Azure DevOps, the application lifestyle management tools, and things like source control as well, so our Git integration, etc. All these things we already have out of the box, and it means it's extremely easy to govern your automation as you would govern any other kind of development. So this is again coming back to treating your RPA development as true development, and have all the good programming practices and governance around it, including things like code reviews, release management, etc., which can all be done because all the projects within UiPath are just very straightforward textual XAML files, if you like. And at the end of the day, we're still innovating, we're still driving the industry forward. I'm sure you're seeing a lot of our press releases of how we're expanding our product set on a continuous basis. It seems like we've now got a really comprehensive process mining capability. Our AI center is extremely powerful in that we can really go through there and integrate AI into any particular automation. Automation Hub is our central repository of ideas for for automation. And you'll see lots of these kind of innovations really continue. We've recently announced our acquisition of Cloud Elements, for example, to really get into the API integration space as well. Well, things like picture-in-picture, again, that's where we've really innovated. So therefore, the idea was that the attended robots could run in the background whilst the user still continues on his desktop. This is extremely powerful in the testing space as well, because a tester's machine can be running test cases in the background on their machine whilst they are continuing doing other activity on their particular desktop. But I think you'll agree, UiPath is one of the most innovative automation companies out there at the moment. And this is all really pulled together in where you are today in this meetup, because we've got a huge community of users out there, and we've got a very active community, and everything from all the the training, etc., is completely free of charge. And I'm sure you're aware that the forum is extremely active. Ask any question there, you're almost certain to get a response extremely quickly. And all our products are totally freely available via our community versions as well. So you can set up a cloud account with us on the community, download the latest version of Studio, and everything you see today, you'll be able to replicate and play with in your own environments to both learn the tool and check out how this could be so beneficial to yourselves. And the last slide before I actually get in and do the end-to-end demonstration is, where does this share, reuse, update, how does all this kind of like fit together? So here I've just got an example where we've got a development environment, which is for a fictitious bank, which is just called UI Bank. And the main applications within this bank are a web portal. And we also have a desktop-based administration application, which is based on the .NET programming language. So from the development team, they're going to go through and create application tests to make sure that these applications are up and running correctly. But also the RPA team will want to have some interaction with these particular applications as part of their business process automation. So they'll be developing the RPA tests alongside their RPA processes as well. And what will happen is they will basically start to realize that they are using a lot of the same resources. So therefore, it makes sense to bundle these into shared assets, which are going to be a particular library. So you might have a library for the web application, and you also might have a library for the admin-based application. And this is like a single source of control for keeping all of your automations in one place. When this development then starts to move through the production life cycle, it starts to get to like UAT testing and pre-production environment, they're obviously still using exactly the same libraries. So if they've got a different version of software in the pre-production environment to what the developers are using, they will just use an older version of a library. So this library will be published and kept up to date in sync with any of the applications which are being developed within a particular organization. And the same is obviously also true for the production system as well. So it's going to be a lot easier to keep all of your automations in sync with any of the internal development which is going on within a particular enterprise. But not only are we going to be reusing automation snippets, but we're also going to be able to reuse assets. So things like credential management, we already have all of this in Orchestrator, where it's very straightforward to get an RPA process to pull credential for a dev environment, test environment, a production environment, and then reuse exactly the same automations in the different environments that will just pull the appropriate credential depending on what the environment variables are, for example. And the whole point of all of this is the value we are creating, which really starts out in the testing department within the development teams, is we are going to be creating value. And this is where this value creation comes from throughout the enterprise, because these libraries and all these assets which can be reused throughout the enterprise is going to be an extremely valuable part and a core part of the the enterprise-wide automation story. So you can now see how the testers who are going to be really managing, updating and maintaining all of these libraries are going to become extremely valuable and a real sought after asset within any organization. So just to finish off before we do the demo, where we want to really get to is a fully automated enterprise where we're going to be transforming testing from a cost center, which is what it's seen as today, it's a necessary evil, to a value center. So from a test automation perspective, we're going to be able to increase the value within the actual quality of any products, because we're going to be able to do things faster, have a higher automation rate, which will result in less defects coming through to the production system. So just the testing itself is going to improve, but also the maintenance of any automation outside of the testing department will also be improved as well. Using the share, reuse, update philosophy, we can reuse a lot of these automations, which is going to really reduce the amount of maintenance your Centre of Excellence team are using in the RPA space, which will significantly increase their life cycle in actually producing new automations. And this really will also come down to the governance side of things, because we're really going to see how we can really treat automation as we treat any kind of development, and truly govern it in a robust way, using version control, making sure we're using test data, which is synthetic test data in a test environment. We still have exposure to to live data in a production environment for the RPA side of things, and all the security which is needed around that we already have with our particular platform. So I would like to go in now and actually show you this in action. So if I just basically close that down. So I would just like to repeat at this point, if you've got any questions, just feel free to type the questions into the chat, and we'll answer these at the end of the presentation. Okay, so what I've got is this fictitious bank, which is called UI Bank. So this is the web portal for this particular bank. And just as an example of some of the testing which might need to be done, the business might say, okay, we want our users to be able to go in and apply for a loan directly from our web portal. So they would say, we could click on it, apply for loan. It would ask them for some basic information, and then the system should respond on whether they would be accepted for a loan, and if that loan was accepted, what rate they would be offered. So this would all start out from a starting point, normally from a requirements management system. So what would happen is the business would create a requirement, they'd discuss what they would need and say, okay, we need a website to be able to give us live quotes for our particular customers. So this is where we would start off with our test manager. So this is just a very brief overview of what the test manager basically is, which is really just a control point for all of our requirements. So here I've got my live quotes requirement, for example. And then what we would also do is define individual test cases which would test this particular requirement. Now, you can also upload things like documentation to this. You can put in different tags, etc. So the test manager itself is really capable. But what we realized early on is that this really needs to be integrated into best of breed tooling, things like Jira. So here we can see that this particular requirement is actually managed outside of our UiPath test manager. If I click on this link, you can see this is the requirement management system within Jira. Now, this will also link through to Azure DevOps, ServiceNow, SAP Solution Manager, and in the future, more third-party tools as well. So this is now where the developers will be really at home, because this is seamlessly integrating into what they use on a day-to-day basis. And we'll be able to manage all the requirement from here, but also all the test cases and the execution result of those test cases can also be managed in that third-party tool as well. But really, I don't want to go into too much depth on the test management piece, because I really want to concentrate on, how are we using UiPath in test, and where does this value, come from? So if I just go back to Studio now, so Studio is the UiPath IDE to create automations. So for those of you who have not seen it, on the left-hand side here, we have our particular project where we can define all of our particular workflows. And each workflow is just a build-up of individual activities. So these are going to be the steps needed to actually automate a particular user interface. So here, for example, I've got my live quotes, which is going to go through my website and enter a particular load of details. Well, just to show you how easy and quick it is to create these, I could go through and create a brand new test case from scratch. I'll just call it a name of test case, which is just going to give me a blank canvas. Now, if I wanted to, I could just use the drag and drop mechanism from my activities, and I could just go in here and say, oh, for some reason, my keyboard, I think the battery on my keyboard has just died. Oh, no, it's not. There we go. I could just basically go in and search on any particular activity, drag and drop it in to create my outline. But a really quick way of doing things is we've got a very comprehensive built-in recorder. So I'll just quickly show you how this would work. What I could do is I could go to my application I want to create a particular test case for, and I could just click on record. And then what will happen is it will ask me where's the starting point for this automation. In this instance, it's going to be the UI Bank website. And then I can just interact with the application as a user would do. So here I can go through, click on products, click on loan, and then click on the button apply for loan. So everything is true, but you can see here we're recognizing all the underlying objects. And it's very easy just to go through and interact with this just as you would do any other kind of standard application. So I could say, go through and say, okay, I want to put in a particular email address or whatever it might be. And here you can see how we build up our automation outline. So if I just save that and come out, you can see how quick and easy it is just to create that basic automation of how I go through and perform that. But really, I don't want to go through and go through my entire end-to-end process, because I've got one I've actually created earlier on. And this is the one called Live Quotes, which was just recorded in the same fashion. But what it's done, it's gone through the entire process of entering all the information into the system. And as part of a test, we're always going to have some form of assertion or verification that the definition of whether this test case is passed or whether it's failed. So in this particular instance, I want to be reading the textual information of the API rate offered and verify that it does indeed equal what I'm expecting. In this instance, it's 11. So if I just go through and run this, what we'll basically see is it will just basically go through that particular same actions I recorded earlier on, entering a particular loan. We'll come back to say whether the loan was acquired, and it'll come back and say, okay, this test passed because I've got the expected value of 11. And just to quickly show you how easy this is now to create it as a data-driven test cases, because most of the time in the testing department, it's a little bit different from RPA automation in that the automation you want to do in testing is not be a very straight-through automation of do X, does something actually occur or not occur? So maybe a value on a screen, maybe an entry into a particular database, etc. So it's normally just a very straight-through forward kind of activity. And that's why using the recorder, even people who are doing manual testing can really get up to speed and create these automations extremely quickly. Well, from a data-driven perspective, what we want to do is the same actions, but each time just use different data set. So here I've got an example where I've just got an Excel spreadsheet of all the different data values for a particular loan. So I've got different amounts, terms, incomes, ages, etc. And each time I'm expecting a different outcome. So to create that as a data-driven test case, all they would need to do is create the test case they've created. When all they would do is go through and basically add test data. And then what would do that you would navigate through to the particular Excel spreadsheet. And then what that would do is create a test case which can now read that external source. And the way it does that, it will automatically for us create arguments as inputs for this particular test case. So this is my same test case of a live quote. So I've updated it to be data-driven, associated with that Excel spreadsheet. So now I have these arguments available to me. And then all the tester would need to do, it would need to go down and update the hard-coded values where I put in my email to these new arguments. So I've got loan email, loan amount, and then obviously update all the input fields and also where we're going to be verifying. Here it's going to be this particular loan rate. So if I just go through now, and when I go through to execute it, we get this extra information that we can run with a particular data variation. So I can just say, go through and say, okay, I want to run with this one data variation here. So these are all the different variations which have been read in from my external source, and just execute that. Here you can see I've obviously just got 5 or 6 different variations, but in reality, we could have setups where there's hundreds or even thousands of different data variations. And that's one of the beauties of automating testing, is that you can do this significantly more robust testing by having super large data sets in these data-driven scenarios. So that's really the basics of how a tester would now go through and create individual test cases within Studio. And once they've created those test cases, they would basically just go through and they would update them to say, I want this test case to be publishable. So, and what would happen at that point is the icon would change from gray to blue. And this is one of the differences between our studio for RPA and testing, is that when we create a testing project, we want each individual test case to be executable on its own right. So therefore, we need to define where the entry points are, where are the definitions of our test cases. And that's what that mechanism is, to mark an individual workflow test case as a publishable test case. And that's how we'll see in a moment how we govern and create these execution sets of these individual test cases. But what I want to quickly show you as well is, from a testing perspective, we haven't been standing still. So what we've realized is one of the challenges, as you mentioned in the presentation, was the maintenance of automation is a real challenge. And here I just really want to show you that what we've done with the core capabilities of UiPath, which is relevant for testing, but also for the RPA world, and just creating more maintainable, more robust automations. Here, I've got a particular automation which is just going to go through and log in to my desktop-based application. So this is the .NET admin application. And I just want to log in with a random username and password. And I should get, the system shouldn't allow me to log into the system. I should get a dialog box to say login has failed. So it's a very straightforward, simple test case, just really logging into our system and checking it doesn't allow anyone to get in with a random username and password. So if I just run this, what you'll see, it'll open up a dialog box and it'll just basically log into the system. And if I just go on there, it'll basically come back, it'll say the login failed, and therefore this particular test case passed. So if I just minimize that, so when we see this one, it'll be a bit easier. What will happen now is, if you imagine in your testing department, they've created a whole suite of test cases around this particular version of the admin application. They've got a whole regression set up. The development team then come along and say, okay, we give you a new version now of our admin app. And I can simulate that just by passing an argument to my application and just pass it the argument v2. And what we'll see is, when we try and run exactly the same test case now, so if I just go through and save that, if I just run this same test case now, what will happen is it will go through and it'll open up the application, but this time you'll see it's got a different look and feel. The developers have just gone in, we've modified how this particular UI looks, and this is a standard kind of error message you would get from any automation tool, whether you're using like some of the testing automation tools, or indeed UiPath, because it cannot find and recognize the object via its selector, because it said it now does not exist. So how do we overcome this problem? Well, what we've done in UiPath is we've created a whole new core automation capability, which we have called now modern automation. And what modern automation will do is go through, and you'll see we can go through and use exactly the same mechanism of recording our activity. So this is exactly the same test case of going into the same application, putting in our username and password. And if I just go through and execute this now, what you'll see, it will open up the banking application, and this was recorded and generated at the same time when the legacy version of the application existed. And you see this test case now worked, came back, and it was all okay. If I make the same modification and simulate that the development team have now given me a new version, and here I'll pass exactly the same argument of v2. If I now run exactly the same test case with the modern automation, what we'll see is the UI's changed, but magically the automation hasn't failed in any way, shape, or form. It's still come back and it's been fully compliant with driving that user interface. So I really want to show you why that is the case. So if I open up my second version of my admin application, and this is what the login screen looks like, you can see here that the selector and the image which is showing us that selector was still on the legacy system. And if I just go in and edit this particular target, we can basically see and drill into how it's recognizing this text field. Here we can see, well, it's correctly recognized that this is my text field I wanted of the username. But here we can also see that we're still using this standard selector. But if I click on this I here to say, show me all these matches, what it will say, it couldn't find any, because this selector for this particular object is now invalid. The developers have renamed it. It's now doesn't say username, it says ID, etc. And that's why we got an error message in our classic automation. But what we've now got is this fallback mechanism where we can fall back and say, okay, if this selector is not found, I also want to be able to use a fuzzy selector. Now, what a fuzzy selector is a really clever mechanism our development team have created to automatically go in there and really put in wild characters and regular expressions, and it can overcome some minor modifications in selectors which won't break your automation. All you'll get is a warning, if you want to, in your particular logs file to say we've used a fuzzy selector rather than that standard selector. And even if a fuzzy selector fails, you can also fall back and start to use the real legacy kind of image-based recognition, so you can recognize things via a particular image on the screen, and again you can alter the accuracy of those particular methods as well. But the other mechanism which makes this really robust is not just have we created a more robust way to use the selectors, but we've also automatically will now add anchors to any of our particular objects, and it's very easy to create new anchors to particular objects as well, so you can have multiple anchors to a particular object. And this is an extra mechanism which will go through, and the engine within UiPath will use anchors to try and uniquely identify particular objects as well. And I would highly encourage you, if you've not tried out the new modern automation, to play around with it, because it means that any automation you make, whether it's RPA or testing, is going to be significantly more robust and easy to maintain over the longer term, because this is a bit of a game changer in the way automation is done, and it's been a huge update really for UiPath in this particular respect. So that's the basics of the modern automation, and what I'm keen to really show you now is what I mentioned before. I've really concentrated on how a test team would be using UiPath in a testing department to create suites of test cases. What I mentioned was ideally what they would be doing is not only creating individual test cases, but creating reusable assets. So the way they would do that is, rather than creating a testing project and go through and have individual test cases, for example, here going through and creating a particular loan quote, what they would want to do is to say, okay, well, this particular action of creating a loan quote, I can encapsulate into a library. And if I just go through and quickly open up my particular library, what we'll see from a library, it's a very similar mechanism to a project, either a testing project or an RPA project. But basically, it just has a different icon. And all we can have now is individual entry points, which are very similar to functions. So for example, I've got a web loan quote here, which is just a XAML file, and it's going to go through exactly the same actions on my user interface of going through and applying for a loan. And all it will have now, it will be expecting particular arguments to be passed into it. So I can now reuse this as a repeatable, reusable step, just as you would do a function in a standard development library. And what they would then do is they would publish this library to a central repository. Normally, this would be the orchestrator, which is governing your UiPath setup. So if I just go back now to my testing project, what we can see is I am referencing that library. So if I just go back in here, we can see that I've got a reference to the library here. So therefore, all my functions within that library are now exposed. So here I've got my activities, and here I've got my UI bank lib, and here we can see all of the individual workflows or functions, if you like, which are available to me. So rather than the developers or the testers now needing to go in and create the test cases from scratch and telling the testers how to go through and create the actual loan itself, all I can now do is say, okay, I'm going to have a test case, and I'm just going to reuse my library function of loan quote, and then I'm just going to pass in the data set I want. So here I'm just going to basically pass in what my particular value is, the amount, the term, etc. And then the return from that particular library call will be returned into variables. Here we've got the accepted, whether it's accepted or not, and what the quote ID is, etc. So my verification is going to now be, okay, does it get accepted? Is the quote ID not null? And also, what is the actual rate? So this is exactly the same test case as what we had before, but we're just reusing the core automation bit of this reusable library. So if I just go through and execute this, just so that you can see this working, I'll just close that down. What we'll see, it'll open up the browser, as you'd expect it to go through and apply for that particular loan and come back. So the real important part to all of this is now, this is a simple way now for the testers to create more test cases. They can use a drag and drop mechanism and start creating testing a lot quicker, because we don't need to do the low level automation anymore. They can reuse a lot of that. But the important thing is now, if you imagine the website changes and a new version of that website is now released, they don't want to really go through and recreate all of their test cases, because this test is still valid. I want to basically go through, create a quote, and I'm really testing that the quoting mechanism is correct. I don't really care how I go in there and create that quote. And I can simulate an update on my particular website. And then what will happen is the test team will say, okay, I need to now apply for a loan in a different way. I will create a new automation for that and publish it as an update to that particular library. And then the whole testing project can just be kept in sync. So I can now say, okay, the library, my website's been updated. I need the new version of a library. I just go into manage packages. I can see my particular dependency here has got a new version. I've got version 4.0. I'll click on update and click on save. And then what it will do, it will update my particular library in this particular project to now use that newer version. And the important thing is, none of my automations need to be modified in any way, shape or form. So this is still exactly the same test case. And if I just go through and execute that now, what it will do is, we'll see here, it'll still go through, open up a particular browser, but now it's going to go in, it's gone through a completely different user interface, and it's still that pop-up. We've got a different look and feel for this loan application. So there's lots of things have now changed in the way this website can give out loans, but fundamentally, the test case is still valid. I want to check I can create a loan, and then it gives me the correct values. So this is really the essence of creating this reusable asset of this library, which really becomes the building blocks to any automation, whether it be testing or indeed RPA, because the next step in this particular journey is how this library can be used from an RPA perspective as well. Before I jump into the RPA project, I just want to quickly go through and show you how a testing project will be managed from an execution and governance side of things as well. Because once we've created all of our individual test cases, what we would want to do is publish these now to our orchestrator. And what we have is the same publish mechanism as what we already have for the RPA, where we would go through and publish a particular project to our orchestrator. If I just go through and quickly publish that, it'll say this project is now being published. If you remember, we marked individual test cases as executable ones. And then what will happen is, in the version of orchestrator, which we now have, I can just go into my orchestrator. I can quickly show you. We've now updated orchestrator to have a specific section for testing. So here I've got my particular folder. I've got my testing department here. And any process which now gets published, which has test cases in it, will be exposed as an executable test case in this tab here. So you can see all the different test cases which are available. But because this is used throughout UiPath, we've got over 25,000 test cases. But again, in reality, an enterprise will have many different departments, many different applications, and many different numbers of test cases. So what we need to have is a way to group sets of test cases together. And this is where we've got our test sets. So here I've got my test set UiBank end-to-end demo. If I just quickly go in and show you how this is built up, all I need to do is go in, give it a particular test set name, and then it'll tell me all of the individual projects which have test cases within them, which I can then execute. So here I just select my end-to-end banking demo, click on next, and it'll show me all the published test cases I have within that particular environment. So I've got the quotes and the data-driven particular test case. If I click on save, I can now go through and say, okay, I've got a test set. What I want to do now is run this as as an entity in itself. So I can run it directly from Orchestrator. So I'll just click on run from there. But also in reality, I can run this now as part of a CI/CD pipeline, for example. I could get a Jenkins build, which would go off and kick off that particular execution. Or I could go through and execute this now as part of a schedule. So what it would do, it would automatically go through and execute a particular schedule for test set. So every evening you can say, I want to go through and run my particular regression test set, etc. Again, we've been very open in the architecture, so it's very easy and straightforward to do this kind of execution of these individual test cases. And here you can see it's kicking off the test cases on my loan. It's gone through like standalone test case. It's also going to go through the data-driven test case, which will just go through the 5 different samples of that particular use case. Worth noting as well, I've actually slowed down some of the automation so that you can see it actually physically happening. Otherwise, it just goes through too quick. But again, coming back to one of the reasons UiPath has been so successful in the RPA world is the automation we have is extremely powerful, strong and robust, and executed in a very fast manner. And all of those benefits will come to the test automation world as well. So this will just go through the final test. And what I just want to quickly show you is how all this is bolted together, because what will happen now is we've got our test case results under the test executions here. And this now is where we get the results from those assertions of whether a test case has passed or failed. So here you can see all the test cases that passed apart from this one here. If I just drill into this, I can go in and view why this assertion failed, and it'll tell me the result from the assertion, what the textual information was. I was expecting to get a value of 7, but I actually got a value of 5. And you can optionally get it to actually take a screenshot as well. So all this information is now stored within Orchestrator to be part of any governance and execution run. But also all of this information is now pulled back to our particular execution results within our test manager. So all the test cases which are defined in here will also have the execution results. And this again is synchronized all the way back to where we started in our application lifecycle management tool, where they get all the individual test results and all the information directly from there. So that's really the basics of how we would pull UiPath into the testing department. They would create automations using the core technology, ideally package up the core portions of their automations into a library. What I want to quickly show you now is how this all really comes together, because traditionally UiPath and the RPA world, we've already had very robust automations to create RPA processes which are then published to production. So if you imagine now in an enterprise where UiPath is used throughout all the different departments, they're going to get access to exactly the same library of functionality which a testing team have created. So this means that if I go into my activities, they still get access to those same activities. But the important thing is here, not only is it going to be quicker and easier now to create an RPA automation, this is one based on the RE framework, it'd be quicker and easier because they don't need to automate the low-level interactions with a particular application. But it also means it's easier to update it as well, because the test team will be exposed to the new version of the banking application, and that will come back and say, okay, we needed to create a new library. And because this just has that library as a dependency, exactly the same mechanism is going to be true here. And they could say, okay, I just need to update my particular UiPath library to the latest version, and everything which is referencing that particular application will continue working because it's just using the library. All the updates and maintenance has been done for us. And this is now how it's going to be super easy now for this particular RPA developer to keep things in sync with their particular application. But what I really wanted to show you as well is the test suite product has been designed to really treat RPA, as I mentioned before, as an application itself. You can see automation as the application in the RPA world, because we're actually deploying robots into a production, and we are actually doing actual work in that production environment. We should be testing that those particular applications are working correctly. And this is where I just want to give you a very quick overview of how that happens. So here, as I mentioned, this is an RPA process which is going to go in to my banking application, and it'll check for any overdrawn accounts. And the way we build up the RE framework is you subdivide the working chunks into individual XAML files. And what we can then do is on any one of these particular XAML files, we can say, okay, here, for example, I've got my process invoice. And what this will basically do, it will go through certain actions. Here it's going to go into Salesforce, navigate to an invoice, and then it's going to go through various different decisions on what it should do given that particular data set. And this is just like, you know, typical what a sub workflow might look like in a more robust, complicated, you know, RPA sample. So to actually test that this is working, what we really need to do is invoke this with different sets of data so that we can make sure that this is working as intended. And the way that would be done, it'd be a straightforward case of selecting a particular process and just go through and click on the create test case. And then what this will do, it will create a new test case. In this instance, I've just left it as the default. And fundamentally, what the test case is going to be is I need to define what the inputs are going to be for my particular workflow. The actual test is going to invoke the actual XAML file, which is part of my RPA process, in this instance, process invoice. And then I'm going to want to verify something has or hasn't occurred. So I'm going to need to define how this test case is going to be defined as pass or fail. And they've done all that previously already. So I've got my process invoice here. So for example, if I just go in, my process invoice is being invoked here. All I'm doing here is setting up some test data, if you like. So I'm going to give it an account name, whether it's taxable and whether it's a new invoice. And when I invoke my sub workflow file, I'm expecting to get the output that the invoice is processed is true and its taxable is also true. So this is just a way to define whether this particular workflow is working correctly. And if I just go through and execute that, what we can do is execute this in debug mode. It'll just execute this individual test case. So it's just going to run through the individual test case. But what we'll see is, because this test case is embedded within the same RPA process it's referencing, we actually get information about what portions of the underlying workflow were actually executed as part of that test case. So here you can see the green activities is everything which got executed. These red boxes show us what wasn't executed. So this basically means we're not 100% certain whether we go down these routes, whether these activities do actually work. So this is basically code coverage from an RPA XAML file perspective. So here we can see we've only got 71% coverage. So not only do we need this test case, but I'll also need more test cases to make sure I can go through all the areas. So here I would now create another test case, giving it different information, and then a final test case passing yet more information. And then what will happen is if I run all of these in debug, what we'll see is it'll run all 3 test cases. And what we want to be aiming for is to have test cases for every portion of our RPA process, which exercises at least once every area within that particular workflow. And therefore, we can come back and say, okay, if all of these test cases pass, we know that that workflow works correctly. It can interact with underlying applications correctly. Everything is working okay. And what we would work towards is creating 100% code coverage for your entire RPA process from start to finish. And that will give you then the confidence that this is now working correctly. But I'm a little bit conscious of the time, so I just really want to show you what good would look like and where we want to be really gearing towards. Because once we've got all of these test cases as part of our RPA process, ideally, we want to be executing these test cases as often as possible to make sure that if anything breaks, we're aware of it as soon as possible. And a way to do that is to version control any project. So here I've got my RPA project, which is version control, but everything you see here is also going to be possible with a testing project as well, because as hopefully you'll be aware now, everything's consolidated together. Well, for this RPA project, I've version controlled it in Azure DevOps under Git. So if I just go in and give it a commit name message of demo, if I do a commit and push, what this will do is create a change set for my Git repository and push that change now to my remote repository, which is in my instance is now on Azure DevOps. And I just want to quickly go in and show you what this will do in the background, because what I've got now is from a governance perspective, I'm treating my RPA process just as I would treat any other development. So here I can fully manage my project within Azure DevOps. I can create tasks, I can associate user stories, test cases, etc. To individual developers. I can do all the good stuff from within the actual board mechanisms here. But what we'll see is I've also created in this particular instance pipelines. And what a pipeline in Azure DevOps is just basically a build system. So I'm listening to the staging branch of my RPA process, and you can see here it's just being kicked off because it's noticed a commit was pushed to that particular branch. And this is just an example of what we could do. I could go in, and if I just go into this particular branch, we can see what's happening. It'll go in, it'll check out the latest changes from my particular code. So it'll pull all my updates I've got. And here you can see it'll not only go through and package up the application, but it's going to now also run every single test case which is in that particular project. And here it's going to go through all the individual projects. I think it goes through 3 or 4 different ones. So it's going to check I can log into my admin application, check I can get a quote from my website, etc. And only at that point, when all the test cases have passed, would we then want to actually deploy this through to maybe a pre-production environment, or indeed even a production environment. And this ability to have this seamless integration into build tools and governance tools like this is really where any large-scale enterprise automation organization should be going towards. Because in Azure DevOps, we can now do the release management in here. We've got release pipelines, all the governance, you can have sign-offs, code reviews, all the good stuff which is standard in normal development practices is now going to be applicable to your RPA workflows as well. And that is where we see the fully automated enterprise really getting a value out of having one tool throughout all the different departments. So hopefully that's given you a reasonable oversight, because I think I've tried to go through how this is used in the different departments and highlighted where the value comes from. So I think at this point, I'll just like to see if there's any questions, and if anyone's got anything they would like to ask me at this point. Have I got any?
I just want to say that now anyone can unmute themselves and ask questions. You don't need to write in the chat. Rick, there were some questions in the chat, and Alex responded to each and every one of them.
Okay, brilliant.
Another question from Radu: is it possible to integrate all this into community? I think he's talking about community edition, but I'm not sure.
I'll just quickly explain where we are with that. So everything you've seen in Studio Pro and the orchestrator is all available in the latest community release. So all the execution of test cases, etc., in orchestrator, the publishing of those test cases, the creation of them is all done. The only bit you can't yet do in the community is the test manager. And the reason for that is at the moment, test manager only works with an on-premise or non-cloud version of Orchestrator. We will be releasing a cloud version of Test Manager, which will then integrate with the community Orchestrator, hopefully by about July time this year. But everything else is completely available in the community editions, and I'd really encourage you to download the latest Studio and have a play around with it so that you can see for yourself its capabilities. Is it possible to show the pipeline in Azure DevOps? Yeah, sure. I'll just quickly show you what that looks like. So if I go into, this is my staging pipeline. So all I've basically got is when you go into your DevOps account,
you're not showing, Rick.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. You'll notice. There we go. Okay, so this is the staging pipeline. And what you'll find is when you go into your Azure DevOps account, you just need to download the UiPath packages. And then what will happen is you'll get all of these capabilities directly within Azure DevOps. So you've got the deploy, install a platform, manage assets. So you can very easily just upload stuff to Orchestrator, package a particular project, run a job. So you can also be using this to kick off other stuff. I mean, this is one of the beauties of UiPath, is extremely extendable. And then what you saw me do was run tests. So what this pipeline will do, it'll create a new VM based on Windows, and it'll then use the UiPath plugin to package up the latest pull from my Git repository. So here, the way you set up Azure DevOps, you associate it with a Git repository. So anything gets committed to staging, it will trigger this pipeline. It will then do that particular pull automatically. And I then basically just package it. I then run it in a test. So this is showing me how I've connected to Orchestrator, my environment folder, etc. And then also the deployment. And you can basically put a conditional deployment in there. So here I'm just saying only deploy it when everything's succeeded. So if there's any test cases fail, it won't then get deployed. But just so that you're aware, I've also extended this one where I've got a fictitious production environment. And when you basically kick off a production pull, that will retest that particular RPA process. And then that will actually go through a release. And here I've got a particular release. And the way these releases work is if I just drill into it, this will now say any successful build which has gone into the production lifecycle will now kick off a deployment to a production orchestrator. And in my particular instance, this is a cloud instance of Orchestrator to really show you that you can start to govern this as you would any other development process and have multiple different test environments, development environments, and production environments, and using Azure DevOps to do all the governance around that. I would recommend you to have a play with this because it's extremely powerful, and I think it's where most of our enterprises will be going from a deployment and management standpoint anyway. Does that answer that question? Hopefully. Is there any other questions? I think that's everything, isn't it? Yeah, so Andrew just put some links into future meetups if you're interested in any of those. But I'd like to say at this point, thank you very much for your time. If you've got any questions on anything which has been raised today, feel free to reach out to a UiPath representative, and we can always do bespoke demonstrations, meetings, workshops to go through anything which was covered here in more detail. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much, Rick, for your time and for your dedication on the subject. We really appreciate it, and I see it sparked a lot of interest. We still have 10 minutes, and I'd like to open up a new chapter, let's say, in these meetups, because I'm not sure how many of you actually joined an in-person meetup when we used to do them, like almost 2 years ago. But we are really, really missing all of you, of course, and we are missing the networking part. So we'd like to leave a few minutes for you to network. So we're going to open breakout rooms. You'll be assigned randomly with 3 people, and I would really love to everyone to have a really short presentation with the name and maybe the place they're from, the country they're from, and to tell one valuable thing that they learned in today's meetup about the subject, of course. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms right now, and we'll have 8 minutes to talk. 1 second. Oops.